So in this week's episode of Mashle, we end up with two equally memorable fights. We have Lance versus Wirth, as well as Mash versus Abyss. Out of the two, Mash's fight would be my favorite, but I'd be lying if I said both didn't pop off in pretty creative ways. I'd argue this is probably Mashle at its most serious. There's a handful of very comedic and funny moments, but if you look at the first fight, there's no humor there. Hell, he doesn't even drop a siscon joke. Lance he may reference and we see the sister, but there's nothing creepy or jokes there. And by the end of it, well, Mash, of course, is going to have some classic, just doesn't know how to interact normally moments. But at the end of the day, we had a pretty serious episode that really flexed the creativity of the magic system and how it can be used in fights. But most importantly, how bad the parents are, or the guardians, of both of these characters that we were going up against, and honestly, you felt pretty bad, all things considered. Now, I do have a full live reaction to episode 9 available on my Patreon if you do want to see my full uncut thoughts. You can head on over there and consider supporting it. I really like this episode. It was definitely one of the strongest episodes in my opinion, and this comes from someone who claims Mashle as being their favorite comedy anime. The amount I've laughed in such a short amount of time is harder than I've laughed to an entire show before. So, for me, to come into an episode that didn't really make me laugh super hard, there's a couple of great jokes. I mean, it really goes to show how good the writing was and how good the fighting choreography was, all things considered. I first want to talk about Lance's fight, because Lance has a cool magic system, which is based on gravity. And the person he's going up against basically has like this mud ability, which doesn't really sound cool on paper, but he makes it work rather well. Not only does he make duplicates of himself, which honestly makes it a little more challenging, and even when he starts using gravity magic to flatten all of them, not a lot was happening. But when Lance really gets going, and he basically pulls out the torture poles, and I'm like, no way is he actually gonna rip this thing from every which direction. Because Buddy pretty much summons Satan in a lot of stories. Giant goat-like creature, and he honestly, if this was a normal creature and not something made of mud, when he rips that thing apart, that would have been blood. That would have been guts and bones and limbs. So it's actually kind of savage where you basically place these poles all around it from top to bottom, all around the side, and you pull at every which direction to rip it apart. And honestly, I kind of like the idea of both of these fights, basically the enemy using their secondary spell, this like trump card that it should be, and just watching both of them pretty much just be in complete distress, seeing their most powerful attack be just obliterated into smithereens. But I think what made these two fights really special is that both sides you actually felt for by the end. Now when it came to Lance and him actually had a lot in common in terms of the idea of what this world does, which is honestly a pretty clever thing that Mashle set up at the beginning, despite the intro of the show being pretty funny. The idea that if you have no magic, you're basically discarded, you'll be killed off, you'll be thrown in jail. This world just doesn't like it. And if you have two lines on your face rather than the standard one, then you're obviously going to have a lot more higher of expectations. And we can see what that does, you know, the trying to be the best you can be and just always being treated as a failure. When we look at what happened with Lance and his sister and how the parents are pretty much ready to give up and then all the expectations go on him, there's a lot similar there, and I like that rather than going the route of just trying to crush these people, we actually are seeing them as we can understand how each of them so far have ended up under this man's rule because he needed them and probably didn't treat them the same way that obviously their parents or their guardians had before. And I think that does a lot for the narrative because it's clear they don't want us to say we're just here to crush them and then they're going to be gone from the story. No, their next chapter of their stories will be very interesting once this is all said and done. Now, when it came to Mash's fight, we get to finally learn exactly what Abyss is about, because up until this point, it's been like, hey, you're similar to me. And I was like, oh, that must mean that Abyss has no magic. And not only does Abyss clearly have magic, also has a evil corrupt eye which removes magic. And this is an interesting one because the idea of a world that's so defined by if you have magic, you're treated as normal. If you don't, you should be killed off. Having someone who has the ability to basically negate one's magic if you look into their eyes, it's interesting seeing how that's pretty much seen as just as corrupt or sick as not having magic at all. And the idea of looking at Mash's upbringing and pretty much the way he would have been treated as being very similar, but obviously Mash had a better end of the stick because his parents may have abandoned him, but at the very least, his parents didn't try to strangle him inside a jail cell after realizing the abilities that your kid might have. And the fight was really cool because the best thing about Mash as a character going up against someone in a world with magic is how he'll incorporate his muscles into something that shouldn't really work on paper. If you're playing Quidditch on the field and propelling yourself with your legs, I mean, that just is comedy that writes itself. But going up against a character who has the ability to not only like enhance their own speed, but pretty much reduce yours, and the way Mash, because of how strong he is, even slowed down, can crush the floor, basically push you in, and the idea of getting stabbed willingly in your stomach and flexing those ab muscles so you can get a hit in is just, it's awesome. It really is. And I like the fact that rather than just making these villains or these antagonists just have a sob story that you say either A, you forgive their crimes, or you think they're now magically solved. Instead, we haven't really seen what they've done all too much. Like, they seemingly are working for someone they probably shouldn't, but they don't really seem evil from where they started out. And the idea of getting to know them on these levels, having Mash be very similar to Abyss, or having Lance be very similar to Wirth, like, it makes sense so they can almost connect on an emotional level, still have them kick ass, but rather than cutting their heads off and walking away, you can have Lance pretty much say, like, you know what, like, I get where you're coming from, man, but, you know, I'm gonna keep on pushing on, and Mash saying, like, I'm never gonna look at you the way you think I will someday. It actually has you pretty excited, or at least it does for me, about the future of those pairings after this battle's all said and done, when we get a Season 2 potentially, because there's a lot to see going forward. I mean, obviously, there's the fear of what they're saying, like, there's no way you can beat our master, even if you still somehow have strength left. But obviously we know Mash, he would run into the pits of hell if it meant coming back home to a nice cream puff, so it'll be interesting to see where they take it. I've known that Mashle does have serious moments in later chapters and later story arcs, so I've been anticipating moments where eventually Mashle would tone down the comedy and let the characters and the story points, the action, and just the more serious backstories take hold. And that's exactly what episode 9 did. I thought the fights were creative, the idea of pulling someone apart, which was this mud demon monster, it was pretty savage all things considered, and the way Mash was able to compensate for a lack of speed was really cool and honestly pretty brutal when he started smacking him around. I mean, I'm a sucker for when characters just get tossed from wall to wall. It's insane, man. It's just absolutely brutal to watch these characters just smack fools around, but rather than looking at them as, haha, see, we crushed the scumbags, I went out saying, damn, we crushed them, but I actually feel pretty bad for their backstory. So, be interested to see where they take it from here, but let me know what you thought. What was your favorite fight out of the two, and what do you hope to see with the future fights going forward in this season? Do let me know down below. Leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new around here, ring that bell, of course, so you can get notified when I upload more Mashle on the channel, and as I mentioned, full live reaction to this episode is available on my Patreon if you're interested, and while you're there, you'll also get a video shoutout. So today we have Demon 69C, Jaxo 23, LCPL Lopez, Jake Mullins, and Davlin. So I appreciate the support, everyone. Please take care and have a good one.